Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Hey, well, thank you, Sean, for that rousing introduction. We actually have, Sean, I know you can't see any of this, but somebody that is speaking to us today from Cleveland. But let me first hit you up with my podcasting teammate, Mr. Paul Connor. Welcome.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much. Excited to be here tonight.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you. So with us is H.G. Myers from Casemate Publishing. They said, hey, do you want to interview an author? And Lauren Steed, who works there, really loved your book. Because I said, well, what's your favorite book? You know, she came and she met us at Historicon in June, and she goes, this is an amazing book. So I'm like, I'll tell you what, I'll do it. And you have to twist my arm to do something on the Civil War. So H.G. Myers, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you very much to say that. I generally like to think the Civil War isn't something that needs to have one's arm twisted over, but, you know, different interests for everyone involved. I am a 2019 graduate of Thiel College in Greenville, Pennsylvania. I got my master's in history in 2021 from the University of Indianapolis, and I'm currently a doctoral student in 19th century American history, focusing in particular on the long Civil War era, 1840 to about 1880, at Case Western Reserve University.
So, before we get into the book, which Paul and I both read, and actually I reread it because I read so much Civil War stuff, I wanted to make sure I got it right. Civil War, it's probably, you go to a bookstore, you're going to find almost more books on that than anything else. I still think, in the Dewey Decimal System or the ISBN catalog, it's probably one of the most written about periods in American history. What drew you to it to write this book, get a PhD in it?
Well, I was born and grew up in and around Erie, Pennsylvania, which is, of course, Erie's only freshwater port on the Great Lakes, Pennsylvania's only freshwater port on the Great Lakes, and is the hometown of Brigadier General Strong Vincent, who my book is about. And as I grew up, I began to acquire a deep and an abiding love of history. And the Civil War era really has always just sort of attracted me. There's just something endlessly fascinating about such a monumental, such a bloody and brutal conflict waged across the continent, basically, and around the world through the naval focus of the war, that has so profoundly shaped our national character. And I started to get onto the story of General Vincent when I was in high school still, through a family friend who was an alumni of Strong Vincent High School, named for him in Erie. And I started to think there's not really much out there on him. So I started poking around at things, started visiting archives and libraries and museums in several different states, trying to just pull as many threads as I could. And the more I looked, the more I dug, the more I found myself thinking the general story of what we hear on July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg about the fighting on Little Round Top isn't quite exactly what the historical truth of the matter is. And that's really why I decided to sort of sit down and start working on the book.
So, and I did want to get to that. One of the things, so we hired a new guy at work. I know, not important for the podcast, big Civil War guy. And we talked about the premise behind your book. And, when a lot of people think of what went on Little Round Top on that day, I would say that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, because he lived, survived the day, became governor of Maine, wrote a book. I believe he didn't die till 1904. really
1914.
1914. Was able to narrate his own story. But when I look at brigade commanders that were extremely effective that day, he's got to be right up front of being him, maybe Webb from, I believe, 2 Corps.
Yep.
But looking at him, I was always familiar with the name. How much do you think? How much do you think the lack of his popularity is due to the fact of a fiction book, Killer Angels, which
I think, yeah,
I'll beat up in a minute.
Well, I will say, as much as Killer Angels is fiction, and as much as it is, a fictionalization, a romanticization in a lot of ways of the Battle of Gettysburg, I don't dislike the Killer Angels. I love the Killer Angels. I think Michael Shara had beautiful, vivid, gripping prose that brought these historical figures to life. I just want to say that right out of the gate because I've gotten a couple reviews out of Maine that have been beating me up. But I think a lot of Chamberlain's recent popularity does stem from the Killer Angels and from its film adaptation Gettysburg and from Ken Burns's documentary series The Civil War in 1990. And I sort of get into this a little bit in the appendix to the book, where I'm sort of tracing the delineation, the path through history of what I call the Chamberlain myth. Because absolutely Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine were remarkably good soldiers on July 2nd, 1863. Absolutely, without question, their bayonet charge against the 15th Alabama was an act of complete and utter heroism. I don't want to try and slur and diminish their bravery, their heroism, their courage under fire in any way. But the end goal of historians is to always try and serve the truth. Now, objectivity is always, something that's a little hoary, a little dicey for historians because there are always so many conflicting viewpoints. And contextualizing the 20th Maine and their fight on Little Round Top, I think, is something that's very important, that very much needs to be done. Because in a lot of cases, like Ken Burns' series, like John Keegan's History of the Civil War, they're treated as if they're the only Union force, the only federal force on Little Round Top. And that is demonstrably false in many different ways. And so I wanted to try and sort of shift this perspective, shift the way that people who would read this book would look at Little Round Top, would look at the fighting up there, sort of provide a broader context for what was going on and what was happening, because that context is missing in, the Killer Angels, in Gettysburg, in Ken Burns' Civil War series. And those have all been so wildly popular over the last, at this point, almost 5 decades since the Killer Angels was published, that there's been a sort of historical amnesia, for lack of a better phrase, about other federal forces on that hill.
I'm going to turn it over to Paul because he does a lot of reading too. Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the in the latest Civil War Times, the Dana Schoaf editor, his editorial talking about what new could there possibly be to say about the Civil War, and I think your book just is a great example of how the difference between what Civil War memory is, which is Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain does myths we talk about, and then the actual Civil War history. And it seems like there's a lot of historians nowadays are digging back into the primary sources, looking at the Civil War, the lost cause, monuments, etc. I'm just curious, why do you think it's taken 160 years? Is there something about this moment now that it makes it, the time is ripe to go relook at those primary sources and examine, what are the real facts and start to challenge those myths? Your book is just one in a series, a lot that are coming out, even though you did a great job of making Gettysburg interesting again. I was very curious about your thoughts on why now?
I think why now isn't I don't think it's really anything to do with external pressures, external focuses, or modes of engagement with primary sources, if that makes sense. There's a trend in historiography, of course, the history of history, the cycles in which historical work is underdone. It's every 30 or 40 or 20 years that you'll just see scholarship sort of shift and reinvent itself. And for the first 40 years, let's say, of the Civil War's historiography from 1865 to about 1905, it was, the era of the lost cause. That's the narrative that was very prominent, very prevalent. Then we started to see a more sort of progressive movement affiliated spin put onto it, a lot more of a focus on the economics of the war, a lot more of a focus on the seeming failures of the Civil War, the failures of Reconstruction, quote unquote, as Archibald Dunning at Columbia was always harping on about. And then we get into the consensus school of history around World War II, around the time where everything's pulling together. There's more that unites Americans than divides them. The Civil War was really just a misunderstanding about the legacy of the Founding Fathers. And that's where you get, titans like Bruce Catton. That's when he's writing into consensus school. And then it shifts towards the new social history emergent in the 1970s, 1980s. That's when you get Jim McPherson and Gary Gallagher first coming onto the scene, those two still reigning titans of Civil War history. And I think it's just the point we're at now just so happens to coincide with another reappraisal, another shift in the way history is being looked at, the shift in the historiography. Because there's nothing inherently new about the idea of going back to the primary sources, going back to the original accounts. That's been really the bread and butter of historians for decades. But there's a wonderful historian. He was kind enough to write the foreword for my book, Dr. Frank Varney. Wonderful man. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him a few times. And he's just coming out with the second volume of his work, reevaluating the memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, because he went back to the sources, he went back to Grant's memoirs, he went back to the official records, and he found that things didn't quite line up between them, and he managed to find some evidence that strongly suggests Grant weaponized his memoirs to deal with people he had had disagreements with, to kind of tear down generals he hadn't liked. And so, in the 160 years since the Civil War, so much effort and so much attention has been focused on Grant's memoirs that really Dr. Varney's work is basically going, something doesn't quite add up. The fish don't quite smell right coming out of this kitchen. And that really was where I got the inspiration to adopt a similar methodological approach to tackle Chamberlain. Because while I don't think Chamberlain, was trying to alter or change the historical record to deal with people he disliked, because there's no evidence he disliked Vincent. There's actually quite a bit of evidence he really liked Vincent as a brigade commander. But just in terms of adopting a similar methodological approach to try and pull back, decades worth of historical myth-making to try and re-examine the sources with a clearer eye towards truth.
Yeah, great question. Great answer, too. Yeah, I noticed that, too. I mean, you talk about the writers, and you place them in period, in an era where they wrote their books, where they did, I just realized it now, they all did have that flavor.
Yeah.
One of the books I thought was amazing about this, and I thought really mentioned Vincent a lot, was Harry Fance's book.
Yes.
His books are amazing. Paul, I know I told you to read them. I'm trying to find my copies because those are books that are worth rereading. As you were researching him, and because you share a geographic tie with him, was it difficult to find a lot about him? Because I think the book's very well resourced. And is there anything you found out about him that really kind of said, wow, never knew that before? That is really interesting.
Well, I'll tackle the second half of that question first. The thing I never knew I thought was interesting, or, well, rather in this case, more amusing rather than interesting. There's really three big historical figures in the broader Erie area, northwestern Pennsylvania. One is Strong Vincent. And there's unfortunately very little cultural memory of him left in the area. He's just a name on now a middle school because of school consolidation to a lot of people. The second is Oliver Hazard Perry, of course, built his fleet in Erie in the War of 1812 before the Battle of Lake Erie. And the third is a guy named Dan Rice. And Dan Rice is a name that's been forgotten pretty much everywhere except for the Erie area. Dan Rice was a circus promoter, a circus entertainer in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. Sort of akin to a P.T. Barnum, but at the time, possibly even a little more famous. And Dan Rice used to bring his circus back to the Erie area, a town called Girard, every winter, and they'd winter in Girard because that's where he had his home. And then in the spring, they'd go off and tour the country again. And Dan Rice actually was the inspiration for the design, the thin, long, pointed beard, the stark eyebrows of Uncle Sam. And I'd known that, and so I'm working on this book. I'm working through what I can find. And I find mention of a recruitment meeting for the 83rd Pennsylvania the Regiment Vincent would serve in the Civil War. At a theater in Erie, in downtown Erie, where Vincent's going to be one of the speakers. The colonel of the regiment, John McLean, is going to be another speaker. And then a third speaker is going to be Dan Rice. And so I just thought that was an amusing little connection there that I had no idea it existed before I came across the newspaper article containing that from the Erie Weekly Gazette in 1861.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It's very cool. And when it comes to actually doing the research, I had a lot of luck in a lot of ways, because while there aren't that many of Vincent's personal papers that, to my knowledge, have survived, they could be sitting out there in someone's attic. That's always the thing with history. You never know what's out there. You only know what you can find in an archive or a library. So I wasn't able to run down many of his personal papers, maybe 4 or 5 letters. But I got lucky in that so much was written by the people around him. Soldiers in his regiment, soldiers in his brigade, his wife in a few instances, friends of his wife. His younger brother wrote a family history in the 1920s that I was able to use and consult. And then just superior officers, his division commander, his corps commander, of course, army commanders like George Meade. And so, while I wasn't able to find a lot of his personal papers, a lot of his own personal thoughts and feelings and views on things, I was able to extrapolate enough from various sources surrounding him to sort of fill in the blank where I could, as much as I could.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because, in addition to being this biography of Strong Vincent, what stood out to me was I think this is an excellent example of just day-to-day admin of the Army of Potomac from 1862 to Gettysburg. And so it's interesting that the primary sources would kind of drive you into more of just a historical narrative of the Army of Potomac that has this main character being Strong Vincent with, it definitely makes it way more interesting and helps it fit into the broader picture of what's happening in the war.
Oh, definitely. And there's a lot of very good literature out there, of course, about the daily life of soldiers in, the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of the Ohio, the Army of the Cumberland. Every army out there in the Civil War has got about 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 books in that vein. But I was sort of approaching it from an unusual perspective for a book like that, because most of those focus on the common soldier, because that's, of course, who the millions who served in the American Civil War primarily were. They were, privates and sergeants, and maybe at the highest a lieutenant, just because of the way rank structures work and the sheer number of people in both federal and Confederate armies. And so I was coming at it really from this officer's perspective, which isn't the way that sort of literature is usually approached. And it, I think, wound up working in my favor probably better than it should have been due to the dearth of his direct documentary footprint.
Yeah, from reading the book, it's almost Paul, I 100% agree with you. I thought it was an interesting take on the history of the Army of the Potomac, Strong Vincent's role in it. And, anytime I could read a book and find out something new, like just in this podcast, I didn't know about the Dan Rice. So now I know
Yeah.
who he is.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting because it's almost a testament to Erie, and Strong Vincent probably should be one of its most famous sons. But with Oliver Hazard Perry and Dan Rice, he does have some competition. And his role on that day, which is a question I've been dying to ask. So Strong Vincent rallied the demoralized 16 Michigan.
Yes.
And he fell right around then. One of the things, and as a historian, I'm going to ask you to kind of get out of your comfort zone here. If Strong Vincent wasn't there, what would the narrative of that battle have been, in your opinion?
I think, and I sort of touch on this very, very, very briefly in my final chapter. I think I have maybe just a sentence on this, but it's always good to sort of tease things out and discuss them more. If Vincent hadn't, moved without orders, if he hadn't taken the personal responsibility and the initiative to move his brigade to defend Little Round Top in response to Gouverneur Warren's call for reinforcements, I think the narrative of that day would have been inversed. Because, of course, by the time that call for reinforcements is going out, Hood's division has already begun its attack against the federal left flank. He's already hitting Sickles at the Peach Orchard salient. And by the time, Warren's aides, or by that point, General Sykes's aide, who's the one who found Vincent, 5th Corps commander, by the time they would have found anyone to move to the hill, I think it would have been the exact polar opposite of the story we know. I think it would have been federal forces fighting their way up the rocky hill, being fired down on by Confederate forces above them. Of course, as this is, a counterfactual, a what-if scenario, we'll never know the truth of how that would have worked out, but based on the fact that Vincent and his brigade arrived only about 5 minutes. They had been online and in position about 5 minutes before the Confederates hit their position. I think it's pretty safe to say it would have probably been the inverse of the story we're used to.
Yeah, definitely could see that. One of the interesting things from reading a lot about this, you look at the other regiments that were in Vincent's brigade, they were heavily engaged, where you look at the 20th Maine, and because of the swing door tactic he used against the 15th Alabama, gets a lot of the credit. But everything I've read, that was not a fun hill to be on for anybody that day.
No, absolutely not. It's sort of hard to visualize as someone who, goes to Gettysburg in 2023. Well, maybe not 2023 since the Park Service has closed Round Top for, structural renovations of the walkways and such because they're eroding. But anyone who goes to Round Top in the modern era, it's a little hard to visualize because despite the efforts of the Park Service to restore as much of the field as possible to its 1863 appearance, there are still areas where that isn't easy to accomplish because there's so much, like in the case of Round Top, young growth forest that's sprung in between and around the hills. In 1863, we know Little Round Top was virtually bare of tree coverage on its western face, on its southern face as well, which is where most of the fighting on July 2nd happened. And now you go there, there's trees all around. It's a lot harder to visualize. And these men were basically exposed on both sides, except for the cover of the rocks, some skinny trees here and there, and whatever they could pile up for themselves, impromptu stone fences, impromptu stone walls. And it's rugged, it's tough terrain. If you go down to the 83rd Pennsylvania's monumented Little Round Top, it's a little hard to get to because it's not, right flat on the top of the hill. It's not got the paved path to get to it, like the 20th Main Monument does. And it's just a very steep, very slippery sort of descent down this dirt path, trying not to trip over tree roots or you're going to fall and break your neck on a boulder. And these men were fighting and dying in this very treacherous terrain in huge awkward clouds of smoke from so much fire being exchanged back and forth. There's an officer in the 140th New York regiment that came to help assist Vincent's brigade on Round Top, Porter Farley. He wrote in, I think it was the 1880s or 1890s, a couple decades later, that it was very like a scene from hell itself when he's on the crest of the hill looking down into the fighting before they advanced.
Yeah, one thing I noticed from your book, the hill itself is a character in it.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because I know I've been there dozens of times. I know we only live 90 miles from it. So I know Paul's been there. You explain how it looked back then. And I'm reading America's Hill of Destiny that also covers it. That battle. And the book didn't do that great of a job of explaining the differences, but the docents of the park do a very good job of that. And I think your book does as well. It's kind of, this book is as much about Erie, the hill itself, Strong Vincent, than a lot of other books have. And I kind of enjoyed that because that hill was important as a defensive position. And, you answered the question previously. Had he not have gotten there with his brigade, and the battle would have really gone the other way, because that's the flank of the Union Army. And if anybody's seen the movie, he keeps reminding him, "You're the flank, dude. Got it." I thought that was interesting.
Well, yeah, I totally agree. Like, that Little Round Top is definitely one of the legendary places of the American Civil War. But, with the rehabilitation that's going on, do you think that'll create more opportunities to tell the Strong Vincent story?
I hope so. I mean, I'm not going to say, the National Park Service has done a bad job or anything, because they haven't. There is a historical wayside there that talks about Strong Vincent. There is a, headquarters tablet, an old War Department headquarters tablet about Vincent's brigade. But the problem isn't with the Park Service. The problem is with the fact that people just drive right past them on their way up to the parking lot at the top of the hill, and no one wanders back down the hill. They get out, they go look at Gouverneur Warren's statue, they get back in their car, they continue on the auto tour.
True.
So I'm not going to say that, the Park Service is at any kind of fault, because they're not. I am hopeful that, some of the work they're doing will make accessing the monuments of Vincent's brigade a little easier, so that I'm not, the only person willing to try and get myself killed to go look at the 83rd Pennsylvania or the 16th Michigan, or even Company B of the 20th Maine's marker, which is on probably the worst maintained trail I've ever been on in my life, with felled trees in the way, rabbit warrens.
Yeah.
It's very hard to get to. I would never have found it if I didn't have the good fortune of knowing a relative, Captain Walter Morrill, who'd commanded the company, who was able to guide me to it. And I think, that's something people would be interested in seeing. And I understand, money's tight. The federal government is the federal government. The National Park Service is a very small piece of the pie. But I think at least, getting the trees up, which I hope they're doing in the process of this rehabilitation work, would go great distances towards improving, I think, the full availability of the full story of the fighting for Round Top.
That's one of the things. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, mine was a fluff question. Go right ahead.
Yeah, that's where the Gettysburg battlefield, I think, is so fortunate, because it's one of the few battlefields that has licensed battlefield guides, right? That people are paying, and so if you can get the licensed battlefield guides to get energized about Strong Vincent, maybe they can start taking folks to these more hidden corners of the battlefield, especially as they get opened up. So I'm just curious, have you got much feedback from folks who are licensed battlefield guides at Gettysburg, and are they? Do they like the story? I mean, have you heard what their thoughts are, if that might change how they're interpreting and telling the story?
I'm gonna be entirely honest. I haven't heard a peep out of Gettysburg at all about this book.
We got to change that.
I hope that changes. I haven't heard a peep out of licensed battlefield guides or park rangers, or I don't even know if it's being sold in the park gift shop at the visitor center. I don't even know that.
I looked. I was there a couple months ago, and it's not there, and I was shocked.
Okay. All I know for certain is that what I've been hearing through the grapevine, however distantly that may be, is that people seem to be reading it, people seem to be liking it. That's all I know about it, which is incredibly flattering and incredibly humbling, because I'm going to be honest, I don't really think I'm that good of a writer, but a lot of other people seem to disagree, so I'll follow the wisdom of the crowd on that one.
We liked your book.
Well, thank you.
Very much, yes.
So if either of you guys, here's my fluff question. I've gone down to where Company B was. I tried to find on Big Round Top the markers for the 2nd U.S. sharpshooters that were up there.
Yeah.
I was never able to find it. I don't know if they put battalion markers up there. Have either of you guys been up there? Because that's ankle breaking country. And were you able to find their positions? Because to this day, I don't think anybody really knows.
I wasn't when I went to try and find them. That, granted, may have been my own fault rather than any lay of the battlefield issues, because it was a quick couple of hours stop on the way back from Antietam a few summers ago, summer of 2017. And I went looking, like you mentioned, for the 2nd U.S. sharpshooter flank markers. Just trying to get an image in my head, a situation in the mental map, as it were, of where they, at least had positions while everything was happening. And I wasn't able to find it. When I do get back there after the Round Tops reopen, I do want to try again. I will say that.
So the beauty of Google, there is a marker, but where the park ranger is standing, I have never seen it. And the way the woods look, and you can see that it's
the woods all
the
same on those hills.
I'm going to go find it the next time I go back.
Yeah, there's Sentinel's website, I think, is like amazing resource for visiting Gettysburg, and they have every single one of those monuments out there. But yeah, finding them in person is way harder than
that's the harder part.
Yeah.
Trying
on Google.
Trying to find those very obscure battalions and regiments of history that only guys like us know.
Yes.
But Gettysburg, it's so well written about, and looking at your book about, really, it's giving a shout out to a hometown hero. It should be sold there. I'm surprised it isn't. A few years ago, 10 years ago, I think I told Paul this story. There was a woman that worked with friends of ours, and she was going through the training to be a tour guide there. She said it's a 10-year process, and 80% of the people wash out. And I'm like, well, that's what Navy SEALs have a better success rate. And she had to pick a part of the battle to write a thesis on. And of course, she did Sickles, which, being a New Yorker, I'll apologize to everybody. Look, it's not a Gettysburg conversation unless we beat up old Dan. But talking about, but I know she mentioned Strong Vincent, and she said, she picked that part of the battlefield where Third Corps was before it moved forward, and then kind of where it retreated to.
Yeah.
Because it was unheralded, and everybody talks about Little Round Top. I think Little Round Top was pivotal, but there's so many stories on it, and I think some of the older books really almost get it wrong. West Point still has the book, The Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. as a must read up there, and that is full of factual errors.
I will say this in defense of the Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. The gentleman who compiled that book, I say it's compiled because, of course, it's a lot of letters and documents all crammed together in a single book, more than it is an overarching narrative written by a man. Oliver Wilcox Norton, who put together that book, was on Vincent's headquarters staff. He was Vincent's headquarters color bearer and bugler. And so up until just before the fighting started, by Army regulations, he must be within so ever many feet of Vincent. And the only reason he left when the fighting started is because Vincent told him, "Down with the flag, Norton, damn it, go behind those rocks with it," when Confederate artillery opened on them on the hilltop. And Norton, to his eternal credit, was the greatest champion of Strong Vincent to come out of the Civil War generation. Until the day he died, and I think it was 1930, Norton was very clear, very direct, and very pointed about the fact that the safety of Little Round Top was the work of Strong Vincent. And he didn't really hedge his bets either. He didn't try and pull his punches. He very clearly took several swipes at Chamberlain throughout his published works regarding the fighting on Little Round Top, because he thought Chamberlain was taking too much credit. There's a wonderful quote from a correspondence Norton had with Ellis Spear, who of course was the acting major of the 20th Maine at Gettysburg, where Spear actually says to Norton that Chamberlain taking so much credit to claim he had been the man to hold Round Top to a group of Bowdoin college students seemed to Spear like robbing the dead, like he was robbing Vincent of the praise that should have been his. And there's a lot of tones of that, of similarities of that in their correspondence. And Norton might have gotten a good few things wrong in Attack and Defense of Little Round Top. He certainly was not a faultless or a flawless man. It's very, very probable that his dislike for the praise and the glory Chamberlain had received had altered his viewpoint and thus made him a bit of a unreliable narrator. But that book, for at least a starting ground to understand the fighting, is still, I think, indispensable.
So you quote in the book that that point in the field was called Chamberlain Avenue and it should have been called Vincent Avenue.
Yes, that's another quote from the correspondence.
Because, you say in the beginning, the prologue of the book, this is going to upset some people. And the fact that you're getting people in Maine upset about it, and, this has happened quite some time ago for our audience, that, you deliver it in those last few chapters.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine, like I said, the new guy at work, he said he was going to read it. I said, I'm going to tell you something very odd. Read the Path Being Forgotten, the end of the book first. Then, because he's very well read on the Civil War, then read the rest of the book.
Okay.
That's the hook.
When I reread it, I read those parts first, because I think I took a lot away from that, because you tie in everything you say in the beginning. Because I think the narrative up till then is really good, and then you kind of go after. No, I'm not going to say go after, but you almost set the record straight. Chamberlain was a subordinate of Vincent. If it wasn't for Vincent's leadership and understanding where to set up on top of that hill, history would have turned out way different.
Well, it's like I point out in that same section, at least I think it's the same section. I know I pointed out somewhere. There's, plenty of glory and laurels, metaphorical laurels, to go around. It's not a zero-sum game. To elevate Vincent, you don't have to diminish Chamberlain into obscurity. And realistically, the saving of Round Top, while Vincent's role, I would argue, was certainly central and instrumental in the defense of the hill, it would be remiss of me to act like Vincent was the only man for whom there should be praise or credit or glory. Chamberlain and the 20th Maine, their famous bayonet charge, is, I think, an almost unparalleled example of heroism in the annals of the American Civil War, because these men are out of ammunition. They're hot, they're tired, they're sweaty, they've been fighting for hours, and they just charge the enemy point blank, bayonet into their musket fire. There's, of course, then Stephen Weed in his brigade when they arrive. Weed, of course, is also fatally wounded defending Round Top. There's Patrick O'Rourke in the 140th New York, who arrived just as Vincent's being shot and wounded and avert the collapse of his right flank, the 16th Michigan. There's Charles Haslett and his battery, I think it's Battery B of the 5th United States Artillery. You know, they can't depress their guns low enough to fire at the Confederates attacking the hill, but they can still fire on the Confederates attacking Sickles' 3rd Corps. And Haslett, of course, is also mortally wounded and dies as a result of injuries sustained defending Round Top. And those are just the officers. You know, there's dozens and scores of ordinary soldiers who fight and die on the Round Top as well. And I think all of their stories deserve to be remembered and focused, not just focus on one regiment in particular out of the one brigade. And then not even just to say that Vincent is the sole man responsible for the defense of Round Top, because he's just one man out of dozens who dies defending that hill. Though he is the one without whom the defense would not have held, I argue.
See, you get an interesting comment in there. You know, so his name should be easily recalled as that of John Reynolds or Elmer Ellsworth, and I love that. You know, and I know for the three of us, we definitely know all the story on John Reynolds and Elmer Ellsworth. But just curious, you know, where do you envision, are there tiers, the general public? Anybody in America generally would know who Grant or Sherman, Sheridan might be, McClellan, and then maybe below that there's a Thomas or Burnside, Hooker. But where do you kind of fit, John Reynolds and Elmer Ellsworth as far as being easily recalled, and how, Chamberlain and Strong Vincent fit into those tiers?
Well, when I wrote that line, funnily enough, I was actually in a Civil War and Reconstruction class at the University of Indianapolis, taught by A. James Fuller, who's a wonderful man. He just a couple of years ago put out a biography of Oliver Morton, Indiana's radical Republican war governor. And I actually wrote that line while I was in his class, because I was working on starting to get things together for my master's thesis, which is what this book is. It's my published master's thesis. And when I was writing this, of course, I'm so deeply immersed and inured in the historiography of the American Civil War, I just rattled off the first two names I could think of when I wrote that line. John Reynolds, I think, is certainly more known to the general public than Elmer Ellsworth is, and that's only because Reynolds is featured in the film Gettysburg. The monument on the spot where he was killed is the first stop of the auto tour at Gettysburg. There's a lot of Reynolds hoorahing out there, which I'm not going to complain about, because Reynolds is a fascinating character if you read about him.
Another Pennsylvanian.
Yes, that I'm just going to say right now, I'm not going to come out here and say the Keystone State saved the Union. No, I just think that's an odd and entertaining coincidence, because Reynolds is also a fascinating character. Elmer Ellsworth, I would be impressed if you could find 2 people out of 1,000 in the general public who knew who the hell he was.
Do you remember
Ellsworth?
Yeah.
He was shot right down the street from us.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I live a half mile from Fort Ward, where they have a museum where his uniform he was wearing that day. They just definitely a local hero. Yeah. A local hero for those of that who take that side for sure.
Yeah, but that's my point. When I wrote that line, when I said Reynolds and Ellsworth, I was thinking, okay, men who died in the service of the United States. But I picked probably 2 of the worst examples I could have picked for the general public. The people who aren't, up to their ears in the history of the American Civil War.
I think the comment stands out because of it. That's why for someone like me, I read that, I was like, wow, that's a really interesting thought. And it seems like that's a realistic thing. Of course, yeah, Strong Vincent should be up there with Elmer Ellsworth and John Reynolds. It makes sense.
I took it the other way. I totally knew who they were. And
Yeah.
I just passed over it because, how many regiments were named after Wasn't there an Ellsworth Avengers was
Sure.
right next
Yes.
to, yeah, it was
Ellsworth's
right there.
Avenger, the 44th New York, were one of the regiments of Vincent's brigade. Yes.
Yeah, and they were from Buffalo, for crying out loud. Nobody goes to Buffalo.
Well, they were from all over New York State. Every
Yeah.
city and county and ward in the state of New York submitted men to that regiment. You had to be over 5 feet 8 inches high. You had to be of good health and character. So it's what's called a picked regiment. It's not general recruiting off the streets. These are men specifically chosen for this regiment. It was supposed to be, the pride of the Empire State, and it did very well. I mean, if you look at their full war record, they are a ferocious regiment in the Army of the Potomac. By the time Appomattox rolls around and the Civil War ends, they've more than earned their battle honors. But yes, I mean, Ellsworth's getting regiments named after him, but besides you and me and people who've been reading about the Civil War for most of our lives, I could walk up to probably some history student, doctoral or undergraduate, and go, "Who's Elmer Ellsworth?" And they would probably have to think long and hard before they could even hazard a guess.
Which is sad.
Yes.
Well, it's an interesting comparison, right? You have Elmer Ellsworth, who was famous in his day, and you have a Chamberlain who is famous in our day, and you have Strong Vincent, who maybe wasn't famous in his day and isn't as famous today, but should be.
Well, he had a little bit of fame. I will say that he had for maybe 2 decades after the war. He was still, a relatively well-known name. So much so
that, monument.
Yeah, so much so that after the dedication of the 83rd Pennsylvania's monument in the 1880s, I think it was 1889, 1888, somewhere in there, his wife, his widow, traveling back to Cincinnati with his brother, is, making the society column in the cities they're stopping in as they're changing trains.
Harvard had a lot of pull back then.
Yes.
Definitely had a lot of pull. Once again, I don't want to beat up on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I've been to Maine. I have no plans on going back. But, they always talk about 20th Maine. And
at this point, I'm afraid they won't even let me in the state.
You're not missing very much. Once you get above a certain line in Maine, you might as well be in South Canada. They speak a different language. But looking at the famous regiments for the Federals that fought that day, I would put, let's just go with brigades. I would look at the Philadelphia Brigade on the center of Cemetery Hill, probably up there as far as brigades. I would throw Strong Vincent's brigade. But when it comes to regiments, I would go with the story of the 1st Minnesota.
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Going to the State House where they have the picture. That book, Last Full Measure of Devotion, is such an amazing book. And I believe there were some comparisons about, well, this was another regiment that fought at Gettysburg. It wasn't just the 20th Maine.
Yeah.
And I saw a review like that, and I'm thinking that to me is how is history, we look at it from a lens today going back, how is that really allowed to happen? Once again, I would think it was the popularity. Chamberlain was very popular after the war in Maine. Everybody knows who he is, but looking at their contribution, they played a pivotal role for a great half hour. But had he not made that move, I would say that with the 140th New York coming up and more units coming up, I wouldn't say he saved the day, Chamberlain. Okay, I'm going to get a little iconoclastic here. But I think he put a coda to those days' events up on the hill. But if you look at some of the other regiments that just never got the treatment that they have, and I guess I blame Shara for that.
Well, Mitch, you know that in the National Guard hallway in the Pentagon, they have one Civil War painting, and it's actually the 1st Minnesota painting. So
I love walking by that poster
So that, yeah,
because I mean that picture. It's probably one of my
it
favorites
is.
there. But it's as I was reading this book, I realized from what I have read, and even worse, I'll admit this, from what I've watched, those very long movies,
Yes.
that it tells a cheap Cliff Note version of the history that's not exactly accurate. I don't remember the 20th Maine being on Cemetery Hill on the third day of the battle.
I'm pretty sure they were not. I believe that was fully just an invention by Shara in order to get his main federal point of view character in place to watch Pickett's charge.
Well, and it gave who was the actor that played him? Jeff
Daniels.
Jeff Daniels. I mean, they were paying him a lot of money, so
Yeah.
you figure because you even mentioned the movie.
Yes.
Maxwell Caulfield played a really good Strong Vincent, and even looked like him a little bit. It was kind of eerie.
Yes.
Eerie. You see, get it? A little play on words. But one of many stories that day that that makes me feel glad that a book like this comes out. And I noticed that a lot of books are coming out that are kind of tearing apart. I wouldn't say the incorrect history, but some of the myths. Like that Scoundrel Sickles was a great book.
Yes.
And that's what I like about this book, because instead of saying, for guys like especially Paul and I, for us to read another Civil War book, a contemporary Civil War book, give us something different. And the Lion of Round Top, to me, gives us something different.
Absolutely.
And that's why I like it. And I've recommended it to friends. And I have to tell you, from rereading it in the last few weeks, I realized how much I did enjoy the book. So I'm going to give everybody out there that likes the Civil War, and you really want to get into I'm going to say a crunchy character, because this is not a name that everybody knows, that to read this book. I know you made fun of your own writing. I thought it was a great book to read, because Little Round Top, to me, is just as big of a character, and so is Erie, Pennsylvania. So I really enjoyed it. So what's the next book on?
Well, I've got a few different ideas I'm kicking around. Most recently, I've been working on what I hope to someday get published, though I know this is going to be a project many, many, many years making that I probably will not keep working on for those entire direct few years. What I hope to do next is a couple of books, maybe 2 or 3, just as a series of study in command type books for the Army of the Potomac, but focus not on McClellan, not on Meade. I want to focus on the two everyone overlooks. I want to focus on Burnside, and I want to focus on Hooker.
Fascinating people.
Yes.
And, not to spoil your next book on that, but you look at what Hooker did for the organization of the Army of the Potomac.
The badges.
Yes.
And right, because the badges, the Army still has those today. And if you look also at what Burnside did as well, really, they kind of molded the Army. That Meade was kind of lucky enough. Okay, this is going to sound horrible. Put in autopilot with great subordinates on July 1st through 3rd, 1863. Once again, my opinion. I don't want to write a book because they'll come after me. How dare you? The General Meade Society in Philadelphia is extremely strong.
Yeah.
And it's a real thing. They have their own building.
Yes, I will say I have a good deal of thanks I need to extend to the General Meade Society, because while they didn't have much in their records or in the General's papers regarding Strong Vincent, they were able to point me towards a couple other places that did have some papers, so I have a soft spot in my heart for the General Meade Society.
Yeah, they're different, and they have I believe for a lot of reenactments, they put up the Army of the Potomac staff.
Yes.
And it's interesting. So General Meigs was the quartermaster for the Army of the Potomac. his great grandson was the U.S. military commander in Europe.
That's right.
Yes.
For a few years. And I remember when I met General Meigs, he's like, just walking around shaking everybody's hand. I go, your relative is, as a logistician, one of my most favorite people to read about.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I loved the new biography of him that came out a few years ago by, I think it was Harrow, the quartermaster. I thought that was a beautifully well done book.
But I still remember meeting a guy that reenacted General Meigs, and I said, "Who's the biggest scoundrel in the Union Army?" And I was waiting for him to say Herman Hauptmann, the railroad guy.
Say
Yes.
symbols.
Right. And sure enough, he goes, "Oh, there's many I can pick from." and that was number 2, because they stay in character, those guys.
Oh yeah.
But they know their history. They really do. Yeah. You got to come back when you do the other books, but I'll tell you what motivated me to say, yeah, I'll do this is I'm going to go back to Lauren Steed. I go, what was the book you read that you enjoyed the most recently? And she said, this is an amazing book. And few people I've met are lovers of history. And I said, okay, I have to do that. So I know it's taken a while, since we talked about it in July, but
yes,
I enjoyed the book. Where can we find the book other than at Casemate Publishing?
The book is, to my knowledge, available almost everywhere books are sold. It's on Amazon. It's at Barnes & Noble. It's even at Blackwell's in Oxford, the United Kingdom, which I find immensely flattering as a lover of historic and prominent bookshops. I believe it's a beautiful place. I believe it's also available on international versions of Amazon. I know it's available on Amazon Germany. So it's out there. I hope some of your listeners will take it upon themselves to read it. And I mean, even if they can't find the way to afford it right now, because times are tight economically for a lot of us, I know there's a good number of public libraries that have it as well.
Yeah, definitely pick it up. And to me, it's not surprising that it is in that bookstore in England. When I lived in England for a couple of years, and when I was moving in, my landlord saw all the books they were moving in. And as they unpacked them, he noticed there was a ton of Civil War books. And when he would come and pick up the rent check, he would sit down and he just wanted to talk about the Civil War, because he's always rented that apartment to Americans, but he never saw someone with that many Civil War books.
Yeah.
And they find it fascinating. And they said, do Americans read about the English Civil War? And I said, if you ask 9 out of 10 Americans, they say, you guys had a Civil War?
Yeah.
Because our Civil War is known as the Civil War.
Yes.
Even in England, they often refer to it as the English Civil War. And
yes.
I find that striking. Maybe it's their way of owning everything. But I dug the book. Paul, you're a fan too.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. And it's just there's so many books out there on Gettysburg, on the Army of the Potomac, but the fact that you're able to take this kind of unique character that went from lieutenant all the way up to brigade commander, really without too many battlefield heroics, and just kind of follow his story, and then to see how he was the ultimate hero on a day that mattered. And the way you told the story, it made it really fun. And so thanks for making me think about the battle a different way. That's always the measure of success, if you've finished a book and changed the way you think about something so monumental. So yeah, thanks for writing it for all of us.
Yeah, and thanks for your time tonight. One last trick question. We tend to ask them. Actually, Paul, for a podcasting rookie, you're pretty good at this. So we're going to have you sit down with Lauren and pick the next book that we do. When you were young, there was that one book that spoke to you, that set you on the path you are now, getting a PhD in the American Civil War period, that we don't know, at the time when you read the book, you didn't know it was going to change your life. What book was that, and how did it change your thinking and set you on this path?
Well, it's really a trick question in this case because the book actually had nothing to do with the American Civil War. So I'm really gonna throw you a curveball here.
I love that.
Yes, it was a book I got as a Christmas present from my late grandfather, Charles Struble, one of the people to whom the book is dedicated for fostering my love of history. Because it was maybe 1999. I was 5 years old, and my parents had rented the film Titanic, and I'd been awestruck at the visuals and everything. Christmas rolled around a couple months later. He got me Robert Ballard's book, The Discovery of the Titanic, all about his discovery of the shipwreck, exploring it, the history of the ship. And I just internalized that book. I read it cover to cover so many times, I wore it out. And it was at that point, reading that book, 5 years old, I told myself, I'm going to be a college professor of history. Now, most kids have their firefighter phase, their astronaut phase. I jumped right to doctorate in history teaching at college.
That is a good book. I am a voracious reader of any engineering disaster.
Yes.
The Titanic's one of them. Book I recommend nobody reads. It's called Down with the Old Canoe.
Yes.
So an amazing book. Paul, I'm going to have you answer the same question. You're not getting off early. Easy.
Yeah, it's tough actually to really. I remember what got me into the Civil War actually was a reenactment. We went to some local county history day, and it was the reenactors for the 42nd Virginia. I remember just sitting there talking with them, and afterwards just getting anything I could. It's if we went to the library. I would get any book I could. There's no one book that I read over and over again. It was me. I just wanted to know everything possible. But I'll tell you, being from Virginia, I'm from Northern Virginia area. My love of Civil War history was very focused on kind of the Eastern theater. And it took me, joining the Air Force and traveling the world to really think about the Civil War more broadly. It's I really have to ponder that if there's any one book that's really changed my perspective. I think it was just I was the same way. I was elementary school age. And seeing that reenactment, just kind of going back to that time and seeing it made me just want to know as much as I could, and I could never get enough. And to this day, still can't get enough.
Yeah. I tell you what, Amazon, I think they have me on Platinum Prime. And I'm going to ask you two guys a question. Really it's a crazy question. Do you find yourself buying books you already own in your vast libraries because you forgot that you owned the book?
Oh, yeah.
Amazon helps you with that. I've actually done that before, and it's you've already owned this on Kindle. Well, thank you. I just saved $20.
Yeah, I went into a Barnes & Noble, and I got Planck's book on Chernobyl before the miniseries came out. And I'm looking, I'm like, why is this really familiar? And I'm halfway through, and I realized I owned it already. And it's maybe I need to spend more time at home. I don't know, or I need to start donating my books, which is another thing. And we'll probably end it with this because we're coming up on an hour. Most of our people can't stand my voice after an hour. How do we get this more pertinent today? My son is 16 and he lives in a house with a ton of Civil War books. How do we get the younger generation? Now, you're going to be an educator. How do we get them to the point where we can do more than just identify names? We can kind of analyze what happened. How do we get folks to that now?
I've always been of the opinion that the reason so many people in the world say they don't like history or they find history boring or they just stop caring about history after high school or after college is that in a lot of cases, history is taught wrong. Now, I don't want that to be a pedagogical dig at, my future colleagues in history departments. I don't want that to be a slight against, the overworked and underpaid social studies teachers across this nation. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that history is primarily taught as a series of dates and events and names. that are drilled rota into the heads of students they're expected to memorize. The Constitutional Convention of 1787, the Articles of Confederation, the War of 1812, and they're just expected to know the term and not much else. The way you get people excited about history, in my experience, as someone who's led a couple tours to Gettysburg for friends of mine who do not care about history, as someone who's tried his best throughout his life to make people understand and appreciate history even when they don't care about it at all. The way to make people care about history isn't to throw a million names and dates at them. It's to bring up the weird things, the unexpected things, the funny things, the unusual things, and extrapolate out from there. Start with, Lysander Cutler in the railroad cut at Gettysburg weighed down with 8 swords because he's taking so many officers' surrenders after they've surrounded them. And work out from there to talk about the context of the first day's battle, work out from there to talk about the context of the Civil War, because if you can explain something to someone in a way that catches their interest, because it's offbeat or quirky or unusual or funny, they're going to listen closer, they're going to retain a lot more information, and they're going to actually develop an interest in whatever it is you're talking to them about.
I agree. That's, my son was not doing well in the Romans.
Yes.
And other than chasing him with a pillium and sword around the house, I don't own any of that. I actually pulled out a ancient war game that I have.
Yeah.
And explained, because he had to know about a legion, a cohort, and he started to pick it up.
Yeah.
Because it gives him context. This really happened. And believe it or not, when we were 20, our stories, our lives have similarity with the 20-year-olds that were on top of that hill that day.
Yeah.
And to try to get that personal story. And the story about Cutler, in the railroad cut, I forgot the name of the Confederate unit that was totally annihilated in the railroad cut, but he must have walked out of there with quite a number of swords.
Yeah.
That's what I think goes back to this personalizing. You guys are both talking about how do you personalize the war, individuals. That's where I just have to put my plug in. My entire adult life, I've been a donor to the American Battlefield Trust because, if you can walk the ground that these people, people that were your age, this 160 years earlier, and see what they went through, I'll tell you, not only just the preserving the battlefield land, but it's just also educational types of events they do. My wife's high school teacher is taking advantage of their teacher seminars. And I would say, Mitch, even next end of April, Manassas, they have a Generations event that the Battlefield Trust is hosting. I got a note on this week. And it's designed for kids like 6 to 16, just to kind of put on some gear and kind of, 16 might be a little old, right? But it's just, you can get out there and just experience it. And that's why they're biographies of Strong Vincent. You're learning about a person, not just nameless soldiers marching, towards the guns. Once you kind of personalize it and put yourself in their shoes, I think you're hooked. And nothing does that like walking on the ground and seeing people dressed up and kind of recreating it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sorry, Mitch. I just wanted to sort of build off Paul for a second there.
No, I'm gonna hit Amazon in a couple minutes here, but go ahead.
Yes. I was just gonna say I love whenever I go somewhere, whether it's DC to the Smithsonian or to Ford's Theater or to Harper's Ferry in West Virginia or to Antietam in Maryland or to Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, or even to James Garfield's house here just outside of Cleveland, or William Henry Harrison's house in Vincennes, Indiana, Grouseland. I love, and I'm probably very much the minority, I love when I run across school groups. Because mostly you're going to see some of those kids looking bored out of their minds to be shepherded through this house or across this battlefield. But there's always going to be at least one or two. There's always going to be one or two kids who are just really getting into it, who are really grasping the personalization of the story being told to them by this docent, by this park ranger, by this battlefield guide. The first time I ever walked the field of Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg back in 2013, the first time I ever walked it about a month before the anniversary, I'm halfway across the last bit of the run between the Emmetsburg Road and the wall, between the ankle and the road. And there's just suddenly this wall of 60, 70 elementary school kids peeking their heads up over the stone wall. They've got, their little orange muzzled pop guns. They're wearing a mixture of blue and gray hats they'd obviously bought in the gift shop. And in a way, to be the rebel in the field they're all shooting at, with glee and delight, they're shrieking in happiness at the timing of my appearance, I thought was one of the best things I've ever experienced in my life, because I helped, even unintentionally, to make that all the more real for them that day.
Did you put a sword, your hat on your sword, kept going?
If I'd had a hat or a sword, I would have, but...
I mean, it didn't work for Low Armistead, but
yeah, we did that.
Yeah, look, what was that?
By high school, we actually so we're from Loudoun County, Virginia, and so the 8th Virginia was our local regiment, and so 11th grade, we actually every class period adopted the identity of one of the companies in that regiment, and they were in Pickett's Charge and had like 90% casualties, and we all had to bring broomsticks, and we recreated, and they gave us ribbons, colored ribbons. Before we left on the walk, and we recreated the charge, and at the end of it, they're like, if you have this color ribbon, sit down, you were killed, or this, you're wounded. Okay, if you were captured, and then if you're still standing, you survived, and it was 10% of the people that on this trip, and that kind of stuff, it just hits home and stays with you forever. And
that's awesome. That is, wow, that really kind of, that's it. I'm going to be up all night, but. Yeah, I'm going to turn back to Sean in the studio. Paul, first of all, knocked it out of the park for the first one.
Thanks, man.
You're going to pick the next one we're going to do. But Hans, thank you so much for this. I enjoyed this book very much. The name of the book is The Lion of Round Top by H.G. Myers. Check it out. Pick it up. He also spoiled some of the other books, but Hans, thank you so much for doing this. And
thank you very much for having me.
And no problem. Sorry this took so long, but when you do your next book, you already have two guys that want to talk about it.
Always good to hear.
All right, we're going to go back to Sean in the studio. Come check us out next week and hit us up on Facebook if you have any questions. Also, you could reach us if you want to speak to we'll pass it on to the author and send it back to Sean in the studio.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.